All right, First Nephi chapter 17. This is where Nephi, after traveling 8 years across the wilderness, finally reaches the land Bountiful. So if we look at the map here, there's Jerusalem up here, and he continues down through the borders of the Red Sea, the valley of Lemuel, to Shazer, and then to that camp where he broke his bow, down to a place called Nahom, and then finally over to Bountiful. And it's at Bountiful where they reach this beach and the ocean. And this is the setting where we come into in 1 Nephi chapter 17, to where they're on the seashore. And Nephi, after 8 years in the wilderness, he gets to the shore and he wakes up and one morning or one afternoon, whenever, hears the voice of the Lord telling him, hey, you need to wake up, you need to go into the mountain. And so he goes into the mountain, and the Lord tells him that he needs to build a ship after the manner which I shall show thee, is what the Lord tells him. And so what Nephi does, very wise, instead of saying, well, cool, Lord, I need to build you a ship, great, show me where to find my tools, show me where to find the wood, all that kind of stuff. Instead, Nephi approaches this with his own thinking as well and says, well, Lord, whither shall I go that I might find ore to molten, that I may make tools to construct the ship after the manner which thou hast shown unto me? So he's not saying, cool, that sounds great, Lord, like where's the tools at? He's actually using his own thinking and realizes, okay, if the Lord wants me to build a ship, then I need to have tools, sure. But in order to have tools, they need to be made. In order to make tools, then I need to make ore. So he does some of his own thinking with the revelation that he's received with the Lord. And with some of that own thinking, then he asks the Lord for some help just on the next step, right? Just the next step. He doesn't ask the Lord, okay, cool, well, if you want me to build a ship, help me build the ship. No. He just starts one step at a time. So after he's told where to go find the ore, he goes and finds it, and he makes some tools with it, right? He has to heat up the fire so that it's hot enough to molten the ore and shape it into the tools that he needs to. And what's interesting as well is that he also, when we read this chapter, Nephi writes this in a way that helps us understand this key concept, that God blesses us when we're obedient and will lead us to the promised land, right? He will lead us to greener pastures, to a brighter future, if we're obedient to him. And if we're not obedient to him, we oftentimes lose the blessings that we otherwise would have had. We lose our promised lands. We lose our promised blessings. Doesn't matter if we are an Israelite, a Gentile, a black, white, Caucasian, male, female, anything like that. We'll learn in this chapter that the Lord just wants his children of the earth to trust in him and be righteous, to keep his commandments. And Nephi, here he strives to keep the commandments of the Lord and to exhort his brethren, to faithfulness and diligence in keeping the commandments. And so what's sad is he starts making these tools of ore, and when his brethren see him doing this, they start to mock him. They start to murmur against him and say, look, you're a fool. Like, I can't believe you're going to build a ship. Like, come on. We've been traveling for 8 years across this desert, and we finally get to a place that has a bunch of palm trees and fruit, and it's bountiful, and now you want to build a ship and hop onto the ocean? Like, no way, dude. Like, you guys are crazy. That's what Laman and Lemuel are thinking. And so they start really contending with him about how foolish they think he is. And so Nephi knows their mission. He knows that he's been called by the Lord. He knows his father was a prophet. He knows that they are to be scattered, a branch of Israel scattered. He knows that they need to make it across the waters to the American continent and follow the Lord. And so he starts laying out some examples from the Old Testament, right? Because they have the brass plates. So they've read about the stories of Moses, and they've read about how the house of Israel, the ancient Israelites there, after Joseph of Egypt, the one with the coat of many colors, that was sold into Egypt. After that, Joseph passes away and new rulers enter into Egypt. They're not so friendly to the Israelites, these new rulers. And they end up, because I think they overthrew the rulers that Joseph of Egypt was actually friendly with. So there's new rulers of Egypt saw these Israelites living in the land, and they're like, look, these people are populating really quickly. We need to find a way to not have them populate so much. So let's take them into captivity and make them slaves. So they do that. So then the children of Israel, the house of Israel, they're made slaves to the Egyptians. And the story goes in the Old Testament that Moses is called to be a prophet that leads them out of bondage, out of slavery to those Egyptians. And when he does that, they're running away from the Egyptian army at that point, and he's the one that has to split the Red Sea, and him and those Israelites run across the Red Sea on dry ground with the armies of Pharaoh chasing them. And just as they cross the Red Sea that had been split, as they cross it, those waters start falling and crashing down on the armies of the Egyptians, and they drown them. The waters are kind of let back into becoming the river that it once was. And Nephi recalls to his brothers, don't you remember that Moses was obedient to God, and therefore the Israelites were able to escape slavery and go to a new promised land, and they made it across the Red Sea because of God? And then he also says, don't you remember the stories where these Israelites, when they were traveling across the wilderness with Moses, how back and forth they were? How sometimes they were righteous, and then other times they disobeyed God, and so their journey was hindered, right? Even after miracles that they saw, don't you remember the house of Israel saw miracles? And then even after seeing those, they rejected the Lord. They didn't listen to his prophet. That's why it took Moses so many years. It took him 40 years to get across that wilderness to a promised land, so to speak. Not the American continent, but no longer in Egypt, moving all the way more over into the land of Canaan and Jerusalem and that area. And so the things that Nephi talks about is look, you guys have been raised with these stories. They're true. That every time the house of Israel disobeyed God and his prophet, they weren't blessed. In fact, God had to get them to pay attention by smiting them with things for example, fiery serpents. He had to send them snakes that would bite them. And then he prepared Moses with a staff that had a serpent on it that was kind of like a symbol of a type almost of Christ, almost look unto Christ on this staff. And when Moses told the Israelites to look at the staff, because they had all been bitten by these serpents, that instruction was so simple, and they didn't have the faith in Moses to look at it because they didn't believe in him, so they didn't. It was too simple. And so Nephi explains that because of their hardness of their hearts, they wouldn't just listen to simple instructions from the Lord that would save them and help them. The Lord's trying to teach us to look towards him. And so Nephi's talking about this as we read in some of these verses here. And he talks about even how the children of the house of Israel, after they were out of slavery, and once they kind of made it across the wilderness, and even after Moses died, then Joshua was the next prophet, and he had to split the river Jordan, and just kind of a mini version of Moses splitting the Red Sea to again show to Israel that God was with them. Even when they crossed that and then they went into those lands, they took over those lands from other people inhabiting them and drove those people out. And Nephi even says, like, look, do you think that the people that our ancestors, our fathers, the house of Israel, that they drove out of the land, do you think the people they drove out of the land were righteous? No, they weren't righteous. But because at that time that they were driving them out of the land, our fathers were being righteous and they were following Moses and keeping his commandments at one point, they were blessed with that promised land and they were able to drive those people out of the land. But do you think that if those people in the land, if they were righteous, do you think that our Father in heaven, do you think the Lord either, do you think Jehovah would have let them get driven out of the land? No, because here's why. And in verse 35 we read, behold, the Lord esteemeth all flesh in one. He that is righteous is favored of God, period. Whether you're an Israelite or whether you're a Gentile or not an Israelite, period, it doesn't matter. If you're righteous, the Lord's not going to suffer you to be driven out of the land by his righteous people. The only time the righteous suffer is because God respects agency, and therefore bad people can choose to do bad things, and we suffer with that. And that's why we have the atonement. That's why we have the Savior's healing power, if we accept it. But as we continue throughout here, that's some of the things that Nephi talks about. So read this slowly as you learn what Nephi's talking about, where he's saying, like, look, the Lord, we need to be obedient to him. If we're not, he curses the land for the sake of the wicked in hopes that the wicked will be humbled and that they'll turn back to God. And in verse 40 it says, he loveth those who will have him to be their God. Behold, he loved our fathers and he covenanted with them, yea, even Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And he remembered the covenants which he had made. Wherefore he did bring them out of the land of Egypt. And he did straighten them in the wilderness with his rod, for they had hardened their hearts, even as ye have. And the Lord straightened them, meaning he kind of he had to literally, just as it sounds, he had to take them from being disobedient and kind of tell them to snap out of it, right? He sent fiery flying serpents among them, and after they were bitten, he prepared a way that they might be healed. And the labor which they had to perform was to look, and because of the simpleness of the way, or the easiness of it, there were many who perished, right? They wouldn't look at that staff that Moses had. So these are some of the stories Nephi references to them. And as we continue to read through this chapter here, Nephi then starts talking to Laman and Lemuel, letting them know, you guys, you're not in the good standing with the Lord. You're swift to do iniquity, but slow to remember the Lord your God, right there in verse 45. He even says, look, you guys have seen an angel, and he spake unto you, and ye have heard his voice from time to time, and he has spoken unto you in a still small voice, but ye were past feeling, that ye could not feel his words. Wherefore he's spoken unto you like unto the voice of thunder, which did cause the earth to shake, as if it were divided asunder. And ye also know that by the power of his almighty word he can cause the earth that it shall pass away. Yea, and ye know that by his word he can cause the rough places to be made smooth, and the smooth places shall be broken up. Oh, then why is it that you can be so hard in your hearts? So he's saying, look, after all you guys have seen, you know God lives. You've heard the voice of the Lord. He's chastised you before many times over the last 8 years we've been traveling around. Everything that we said we were going to do, go get the brass plates, all that kind of stuff, you guys, everything the Lord told us to do, we've done, and it's happened. So why are you so hard-hearted? And then he starts telling them, look, my soul is rent with anguish because of you, and my heart is pained. I fear that lest ye shall be cast off forever. Behold, I'm full of the Spirit of God, insomuch that my frame has no strength. So he's saying, I feel the Spirit of the Lord. I know that I'm commanded to build a ship, guys. After all these years, I've been following the Lord, and every time I have, he's taken us to where he told us we needed to go. From a broken bow, where I was able to get us food, to going back and getting the brass plates, to us being able to survive in the wilderness. And he even continues to tell them, look, later on in this chapter, we'll learn, he says, like, look, I know that Jerusalem is going to be destroyed. Like, the Lord's told us that. So give it up, guys. We need to start, like, focusing and doing what the Lord tells us to do. You need to help me build the ship. And, excuse me, obviously his brother and Laman and Lemuel, they're not very happy about this. And so you'll notice when you read this chapter that the Lord does some pretty powerful things with Nephi, where Nephi tells him, like, look, if you guys want to lay your hands on me, you're going to regret that. So do not touch me, or you will be smitten. And so I'll kind of leave that as an open thing as you read through this and just learn how the Lord empowers Nephi to protect him from his brothers and to convince them that they need to help Nephi on this next step of building a ship, which is a huge step to get from this land of Bountiful right here onto that ocean and headed towards the promised land, which is on that American continent. So really good. Take your time reading through this and notice some of the things you might learn about how the Lord feels about us as children of God and what he really desires. And I really do think it comes down to the fact that he loveth those who will have him to be their God. You know, it's not that he doesn't love all of us, but he especially loveth those who will have him to be their God. Right? Behold, the Lord esteemeth all flesh in one. He that is righteous is favored of God. Like, it's a real thing. I know that, like, even though God does love all of his children, and he weeps for all those who choose wicked and who choose to hurt his other children, but it can't be denied that he doesn't favor those who keep his commandments. And it's just by law that they're favored. Like, it's just the natural results of natural spiritual righteousness and the consequences of being righteous. And in the same effect, the consequences of sin that separates us from God, and the need for a Savior to be able to overcome those spiritual wounds and that sin so that we can, again, feel close to God again and be guided by him and in our thoughts and in our desires as well. So 1 Nephi 17, also a really great chapter for understanding obedience to the Lord and the results of disobedience and those things. So hopefully you'll get a lot from it.